By the end of his life, Elvis Presley wasn't just a man. He was an institution, a monument in a rhinestone jumpsuit. He was the undisputed king of rock and roll, a global icon who had it all: fame, fortune, and the eternal adoration of millions. But behind the sequin curtain and that carefully managed public smile, the king was a man who held some deep-seated, complex, and often bitter feelings. The world of celebrity can be a battlefield of brutal backstabbing and public meltdowns. And Elvis was one of its greatest warriors, while his public persona was kept almost unnaturally clean. Those closest to Elvis knew a different story was being told behind the gilded gates of Graceland. There's a persistent legend that just before his tragic death, Elvis had a secret list of enemies, three titans of the entertainment world he privately couldn't stand. After decades of whispers, we're investigating this alleged list. We're about to uncover the shocking personal, professional, and political reasons behind the king's hidden conflicts with three of music's biggest icons. Be warned, you might never see the king or these stars the same way again. Coming in at number 3 is the chairman of the board himself. It's the titan of the generation before him, Frank Sinatra. Long before Elvis wore sequins, Sinatra wore suits, and he ruled a polished world of crooning and class. To get the friction between these two giants, you have to understand the earthquake that was shaking up American culture. Sinatra was the old guard. Elvis was the earthquake on the mid-1950s. Sinatra didn't just dislike rock and roll. He declared public war on it. In a now infamous interview, he called rock and roll the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it has been my misfortune to hear. He didn't stop there either. He called it phony and false and labeled its performers cretinous goons. For a young Elvis who was just starting his climb, these weren't just abstract words. They felt like a personal insult. He'd grown up admiring singers like Sinatra, dreaming of their respect. Instead, one of his heroes publicly condemned him. The media, always hungry for a good rivalry, immediately framed it as a clash of generations. Sinatra, the voice of the parents, versus Elvis, the siren song of their rebellious kids. When asked about Sinatra's brutal comments, a young Elvis played it cool but with a sharp edge. He said he admired Sinatra but reminded the press that Sinatra's own rise to fame with screaming Bobby Soxers wasn't so different from his. He basically called Sinatra a hypocrite, and a clear line was drawn in the sand. The tension was more than just professional. It became personal. The story goes that behind the scenes, Elvis felt nothing but a cold shoulder from the Hollywood elite. Some in his circle have claimed he privately called Sinatra Old Vegas, a symbol of the rigid establishment that refused to acknowledge rock's raw power. To Elvis, Sinatra wasn't just a critic. He was the gatekeeper of a world trying to lock him out. Things got even more complicated in 1960. Elvis was back from the Army, and his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, knew he needed to look more mainstream. And who better to give that seal of approval than the very man who had trashed him? In a savvy move to boost his own TV ratings, Sinatra invited Elvis onto his show. Welcome home, Elvis. On camera, they were total pros. They smiled, shook hands, and even performed a playful duet, swapping lines from Love Me Tender and Witchcraft. It looked like a passing of the torch, or at least a truce. But according to many sources close to Elvis, the on-screen chemistry was just an act. Behind the smiles, the old wounds hadn't healed. Elvis looked respectable in a tuxedo, but some felt he also looked uncomfortable, a rebel forced into the uniform of the establishment. But the most audacious chapter in their rivalry allegedly happened off-camera on the set of Elvis's film, G.I. Blues. His co-star was the fiery dancer Juliette Prowse, who just so happened to be Frank Sinatra's fiancée. Prowse herself later said she and Elvis had a passionate affair during the film, describing a powerful sexual attraction. They kept it secret, always meeting in his room, while some paint this as a deliberate power move by Elvis Ekwe to get back at the man who insulted him. The reality was likely more complicated. Prowse was surprisingly candid, stating, "Frank and I are mature people. We don't go for this teenage bit about going steady." She even claimed Sinatra knew about the affair. The engagement did end in 1962, with Prowse saying Sinatra wanted her to give up her career, price she wouldn't pay. Whether the affair was the cause or not, the image of Elvis romancing Sinatra's fiancé added fuel to the fire. This dynamic was further complicated by another Sinatra, Frank's daughter, Nancy. Years later, Elvis and Nancy co-starred in the film Speedway and became close. However, according to letters Elvis reportedly wrote, he was afraid of any romance with Nancy, feeling that toying with Frank's daughter was like playing with fire, a sign of his wariness of the famously temperamental Sinatra. Despite the tension, their relationship seemed to soften over the years into a mutual respect born of shared superstardom. Sinatra even reportedly lent Elvis's private jet for his wedding. When Elvis died, Sinatra gave a heartfelt statement, "I shall miss him dearly as a friend. He was a warm, considerate, and generous man." Still, for those who remember the verbal attacks and the staged truce, the relationship between the crooner and the king would always be defined by its rocky start. If the rivalry with Sinatra was a Cold War fought in the press, this next one was a chaotic and downright dangerous clash. He was a fellow pioneer of rock and roll, another Southern boy from Sun Records in Memphis with fire in his fingers. But where Elvis knew how to package rebellion for the mainstream, Jerry Lee Lewis was pure, unadulterated chaos from the start. Their careers were intertwined. They were both part of the legendary $1 Million Quartet, that impromptu 1956 jam session at Sun Studios with Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins. On the surface, they were brothers in a new musical revolution, but beneath it all was a deep difference in temperament. Elvis, for all his swagger, was meticulously managed. He cleaned up his act, served in the army, and cultivated the image of a polite Southern boy who just happened to be a rock god. Jerry Lee Lewis, on the other hand, played by no one's rules. Nicknamed the Killer for his ferocious piano style, he lived a life that was an insult to control. He famously married his 13-year-old cousin, a scandal that nearly wrecked his career. He was known for heavy drinking and wild antics. For Elvis, who walked a tightrope between rebel and role model, Lewis was a horrifying reflection of what happens when you let the chaos take over. This simmering unease erupted in one of the most bizarre incidents in rock history. The drama unfolded over 2 nights in November 1976. Less than a year before Elvis's death, on November 22nd, Jerry Lee Lewis rolled up to Graceland and asked to see Elvis, the guard. Harold Lloyd told him the king was asleep, and Lewis drove away. A few hours later, Lewis flipped his Rolls-Royce and was cited for a DUI. But that was just the prelude. Around 2:30 a.m. the next night, Lewis returned to Graceland. This time, he was not polite. The guard recalled that Lewis was drunk, furious, and demanding to see the king. "He was out of his mind, man," Lloyd said. "He was screaming, hollerin', and coosin'. Get on the goddamn phone, ... Tell him the killer's here to see him." As if that wasn't alarming enough, the guard spotted a pistol on the dashboard. He called the house and was told to phone the police. While he was on the phone, Elvis himself, who was watching the whole thing on his security cameras, called down. Lloyd remembered Elvis asking, "WHWH, what the hell's going on down there, Harold?" When Lloyd explained that a drunk Jerry Lee Lewis was outside with a pistol, Elvis's response was swift. "Oh, I don't want to talk to that crazy son-of-a bitch," Elvis allegedly said, telling the guard to have the police lock his butt up and throw the goddamn key away. When the police arrived, they found Lewis still in his car. A pistol, a loaded .38 caliber Derringer, was on the floor. He was arrested for carrying a weapon and public drunkenness. And the story became a national sensation. Lewis's own account was slightly different. He claimed Elvis had actually called and invited him over, and that a local bar owner had given him the gun for protection. When police asked if he intended to shoot Elvis, he sarcastically replied, "Well, if you're silly enough to think that." Probably. Whether Elvis truly invited him is a mystery, clouded by the substances affecting both men. But for Elvis, the incident was a horrifying confirmation of his fears about Louis. This wasn't just a rival, this was a man who brought chaos and loaded weapons to his front door. The professional jealousy had turned into genuine personal paranoia. He no longer saw Jerry Lee Lewis as a peer. He saw him as a threat. The two men, once brothers in the birth of a new sound, never met again. 10 months later, the king was dead. If you're finding this look into the secret world of celebrity rivalries fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the shocking conclusion to our list. We've seen a rivalry born from generational clashes and another fueled by dangerous chaos. But according to many close to Elvis, the animosity he felt for our #1 star was the deepest of all. It wasn't just about music or fame. It was a battle for the very soul of America. The man who reportedly earned Elvis's most intense ire was the rebellious voice of the Beatles. John Lennon. To understand this, you have to go back to the beginning. Before he was a Beatle, John Lennon was a massive Elvis fan. He famously said, "Nothing affected me until I heard Elvis. Without Elvis, there would be no Beatles." The raw energy of early Elvis was the lightning bolt that inspired Lennon to change the world. So, when the Beatles finally got to meet him in August 1965, it should have been a legendary summit. Instead, it was a legendary disaster. The meeting was at Elvis's Bel Air home, and by all accounts, the atmosphere was painfully awkward. Priscilla Presley later recalled how the Beatles were so starstruck they could barely speak. John was shy, timid, looking at him. I really believe that he just couldn't believe that he was actually there with Elvis Presley. The silence was so bad that Elvis eventually quipped, "If you guys are just going to sit there and stare at me, I'm going to bed." But a different tension was brewing. John Lennon, never one to hold back, reportedly broke the ice by asking what happened to the old rock and roll Elvis. A clear jab at the cheesy movie soundtracks that defined Elvis's career in the 60s. The real clash, though, was ideological. As an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War, Lennon was deeply offended by what he saw in Elvis's home. For Elvis, a proud patriot who had served his country, Lennon's growing anti-war, anti-establishment persona wasn't just a political difference. It was a personal affront. He saw Lennon as ungrateful and disrespectful to the very country that made him a star. The meeting ended with both sides disillusioned. The Beatles were disappointed. Their idol had become, in their eyes, part of the establishment. And Elvis was reportedly furious, feeling his hospitality and values had been attacked in his own home. According to some reports, he would fly into a rage whenever Lennon's name was mentioned. This one awkward evening planted the seeds of a deep resentment in Elvis. As the 60s wore on, his animosity grew. He watched as the Beatles didn't just rival his popularity, but completely eclipsed it, leading a cultural revolution he found alien and dangerous. While Elvis represented a more conservative, goddamn country rebellion, the Beatles, and especially Lennon, embodied the counterculture. Their embrace of psychedelic drugs and radical politics was everything Elvis stood against. He saw them as a corrupting influence on American youth. This private resentment boiled over in the most extraordinary way. On December 21st, 1970, Elvis Presley showed up at the White House with a handwritten letter and requested a meeting with President Richard Nixon. In the letter, he offered his services to the country, writing, "I can and will be of any service that I can to help the country out." His main concern, the drug culture, and the destructive influence of figures like the Beatles. He wanted Nixon to make him a federal agent at large. In the now-famous meeting, official White House memos state, Presley indicated that he thought the Beatles had been a real force for anti-American spirit. He said that the Beatles came to this country, made their money, and then returned to England where they promoted an anti-American theme. Elvis told the president he had been studying communist brainwashing and drug culture and could reach young people in a way the government couldn't. Now, the story that Nixon deputized Elvis to spy on Lennon is a fun myth, but the core of the story is true. Elvis Presley used his unique access to the highest office in the land to denounce his musical rival as an enemy of the state. The irony is staggering. The original rebel whose hips were once too dangerous for TV was now the protector of the very establishment that once condemned him. He saw in John Lennon a twisted mirror image of his own youthful rebellion. While his issues with Sinatra were about respect and his fears of Jerry Lee Lewis were about safety, his conflict with John Lennon was a battle of ideologies. In Elvis's mind, Lennon hadn't just stolen his crown. He was poisoning the well of American culture. And that was a betrayal the king could never forgive. So, was there a literal list of enemies locked away at Graceland? The evidence says that's more legend than fact. But the stories behind these intense rivalries reveal something far more compelling. A portrait of a man struggling with his own legacy in a rapidly changing world. This so-called hate list is really a map of Elvis's deepest anxieties. The conflict with Sinatra shows a man desperate for establishment respect. The paranoia around Jerry Lee Lewis shows a man terrified of the chaos he had so carefully contained. And the ideological war with John Lennon exposes a patriot who felt his country and his own cultural significance was under attack. These stories show that behind the legend was a complex, passionate, and deeply human man, fighting to hold on to his throne. Elvis Presley may have been an icon, but he was also a product of his rivalries, shaped as much by the stars he reportedly resented as by the millions who adored him. Which of these rivalries shocked you the most? Was Elvis's right to be wary, or was it all just professional jealousy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for more deep dives into the hidden dramas of music history, don't forget to like and subscribe.